A stranger tried to kidnap a group of schoolchildren on a lonely highway. One Hell's Angel stood in his way. The sun hung low over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Duke Marsh wiped his hands on a shop rag stained with years of grease and oil, standing back to look at the '67 Mustang he had just finished. The engine purred like a happy cat when he tested it, smooth and even. That sound never got old. "That's a beauty, Duke," Tommy called out from across the garage. The kid was 22, lanky, with a mop of brown hair that always needed cutting. He'd been working at Marsh & Sons for almost a year now, and Duke had grown fond of him in that quiet way he grew fond of most things. Slowly, carefully, like trust was something you built brick by brick instead of just handing over. "She'll run another 20 years if her owner treats her right," Duke said, closing the hood with a solid thunk. Tommy grinned and started sweeping up the metal shavings by the workbench. "You heading out?" "Yeah, lock up when you're done. And Tommy?" "Yeah, boss." "Good work today." Duke meant it. The kid had a good eye for engines, better than most guys twice his age. Duke had seen a lot of young men come through that garage looking for work, and most of them didn't have the patience for it. Tommy did. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. "Thanks, Duke. See you tomorrow." Duke grabbed his leather jacket off the hook by the door. The worn patches on the back faded from years of sun and rain. The Hell's Angels emblem was still there, stitched tight, a piece of him that never came off even when he wanted it to sometimes. He pulled it on, feeling the familiar weight settle across his shoulders like an old friend. Outside, his Harley waited for him in the gravel lot, chrome catching the last light of the day. Duke ran a hand along the seat before swinging his leg over. The bike rumbled to life beneath him, a deep growl that vibrated up through his boots and into his chest. There was something about that sound, that feeling, that always settled him. Like the world made sense again. He pulled out onto Route 9, the long stretch of highway that wound through the hills outside Millbrook. Trees lined both sides of the road, thick and green, casting long shadows across the pavement as the sun dipped lower. This was Duke's favorite part of the day. The ride home. 15 years ago, he wouldn't have believed this life was possible. Back then, he was just a scared kid with nowhere to go, sleeping under bridges and in the backs of abandoned buildings, running from things he didn't want to think about anymore. He'd done things he wasn't proud of, made choices that still sat heavy in his gut some nights. But somewhere along the way, he'd found his way into the garage business, learned a trade, built something real with his own 2 hands. Marsh & Sons garage wasn't much to look at, just a squat brick building with 2 bays and a gravel lot. But it was his. Every bolt he tightened, every engine he brought back to life, felt like proof that a man could change, that the past didn't have to be the whole story. The wind picked up as Duke leaned into a curve, the trees blurring past in streaks of green and gold. He thought about Tommy back at the shop, about the quiet satisfaction of watching a young man learn a trade the right way. He thought about his brothers in the chapter, men who had become more like family than the family he'd lost long ago. He thought about how far he'd come from that scared kid under the bridge. This ride, this stretch of empty highway with nothing but hills and trees and the setting sun, this was his church. His time to think. His time to just be. Duke rounded a bend in the road, the bike leaning smooth beneath him, and that's when he saw it. A school bus, yellow and unmistakable, pulled onto the gravel shoulder up ahead. Its hazard lights blinked steady, orange flashes against the deepening dusk. Duke eased off the throttle, slowing his Harley to a crawl. Something about the way the bus sat there, Doors open, no other cars around for miles, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd learned a long time ago to trust that feeling. Duke pulled his bike onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and killed the engine. The quiet that followed felt heavy. Wrong somehow, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears instead of soothing them. He sat there for a second, just looking. The bus was one of the older models, the paint a little faded, the number 12 stenciled on the side in peeling black letters. Duke knew it. He'd seen it plenty of times pulling out of the elementary school lot when he drove past in the mornings. It usually rolled along without a hitch, an old, reliable thing, kind of like the Mustangs he loved fixing up. But nothing about this looked reliable now. A man stood at the open bus door, one foot up on the step, leaning in like he belonged there. He wore a brown delivery uniform, the kind with a company patch stitched over the chest pocket, though from this distance Duke couldn't make out what it said. A ball cap sat low on his head, shading his eyes. "Come on now," the man was saying, his voice pitched high and friendly, the kind of friendly that tried too hard. "Everybody grab your backpacks. We're going to get you all home safe and sound, don't you worry." A few kids peered out from behind the bus windows, faces pressed to the glass. Duke could see the fear plain as day. Kids didn't hide things well, not like grown men did. One little girl in a pink jacket had tears streaking down her cheeks. A boy near the back sat frozen, gripping the seat in front of him with both hands. And behind the wheel sat Walter. Duke didn't know his name yet, not that it would have mattered right then. All he saw was an old man, gray-haired and thin-shouldered, sitting rigid as a fence post, both hands still curled around the steering wheel like he'd forgotten how to let go. His face had gone the color of old paper. His eyes were wide, darting, full of something Duke recognized instantly. Terror. Duke swung his leg off the bike slow and easy, boots hitting gravel. He didn't rush. Rushing spooked people, and right now he needed everyone calm, especially himself. He walked toward the bus with the kind of steady gait he used when approaching a nervous animal, unhurried, deliberate, non-threatening, despite the ink covering his arms and the patch on his back. "Everything all right over here?" Duke called out, keeping his voice level. The delivery man's head snapped around. For just a second, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even panic, before he smoothed it over with a smile that didn't sit right on him. "All good, friend," the man said. "Just had a little situation. Driver here?" He jerked a thumb toward Walter without looking at him. "Had some kind of medical thing, chest pains, maybe a heart thing. Dispatch sent me out to get these kids home safe while they sort out an ambulance." Duke's eyes flicked to Walter. The old man's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hands trembled where they gripped the wheel, knuckles white. "That right?" Duke asked, keeping his tone easy, almost conversational, though every instinct in his body had gone tight and alert, the same feeling he used to get right before trouble found him back in his younger days. He'd learned to trust that feeling. It had kept him alive more than once. "Yes, sir," the man said, already turning back toward the children. "Come on now, kids. Single file, let's go." But Duke noticed something. The man's eyes never once landed on Walter. Not for a second. A guy claiming his co-worker just had a medical emergency. You'd think he'd look at him, check on him, something. But this man's gaze slid right past Walter like he wasn't even there. Walter's eyes locked onto Duke instead, wide and desperate, his lips trembling like he was trying to force words out that wouldn't come. Something was very wrong here, and every word out of the stranger's mouth felt like a lie wrapped around the truth, sitting frozen behind that steering wheel. Duke stuck his hands in his jacket pockets, easy and slow, like he had nowhere else to be in the world. "Name's Duke," he said. I run the garage over on 5th. Which company you with? The man blinked. Falcon Express. Regional delivery. Never heard of them, Duke said, still friendly, still calm. They usually run bus routes too? Seems like a strange thing for a delivery company to handle. We do contract work. Emergency stuff. Schools call us sometimes when their usual services can't get out fast enough. Duke nodded slow, like that made all the sense in the world, even though nothing about it did. He let his eyes drift, casual as anything, past the man's shoulder to the van parked behind the bus. It was a plain white cargo van, the kind you'd see hauling furniture or tools. No company name on the side. No logo, no phone number, nothing. Just blank white metal, and windows tinted so dark Duke couldn't see a thing inside. The plate on the back didn't match anything he'd expect from a business vehicle either. It was a regular passenger plate, the numbers scuffed like someone had tried to scrape at them with something rough. "Dispatch send you in that?" Duke asked, nodding toward it. The man's eyes cut sideways, quick, before snapping back to Duke's face. "Yeah, that's the company vehicle. Don't see a logo on it. They're getting it repainted." The man's smile stretched thinner. "Look, I appreciate you stopping to check on things, but I got a job to do here. These kids need to get home, and I'm on a schedule." Duke's gaze slid back to Walter. The old man's mouth was still working, silent, his hands still frozen on the wheel, his eyes locked onto Duke's like a drowning man reaching for a rope. "You said he's having chest pains," Duke said, nodding toward Walter. "He say anything to you before the pains started?" "Didn't really get a chance to talk much. Started calling it in the second he waved me down." "He waved you down?" "That's right." Duke let the silence sit there a second, long enough for it to feel uncomfortable. "Funny," he said. "Man having a heart attack, and he's still got enough strength to keep both hands wrapped around that wheel like that." The delivery man's jaw tightened. His friendly mask slipped, just a little, just enough for Duke to see the something underneath, something hard and cornered and dangerous. "Look, I don't know what you're getting at, friend, but I don't have time for 20 questions. Dispatch is waiting on me. Ambulance is coming for the driver. I need these kids off this bus right now." "You said an ambulance was already called." "It is. It's coming. I need to get moving." Duke didn't answer right away. He looked past the man again, at the little girl in the pink jacket pressed against the window, at the boy in the back still frozen solid in his seat, at all those small, scared faces watching a stranger try to talk them into stepping off the only safe place they had left. Then he looked at the van again. Tinted windows, no markings, mismatched plate. Something cold and sure settled into Duke's chest, the same feeling he used to get right before a fight, right before something broke loose, and there was no taking it back. "I think I'll just wait here till that ambulance shows up," Duke said, voice still level, still calm, but there was iron underneath it now. Iron the man couldn't miss. "Keep an eye on things till the professionals arrive." The man's face twisted, agitation cracking through the friendly act like ice breaking on a pond. "I don't need you keeping an eye on anything. This isn't your business. These kids need to come with me now, and I don't have time to argue with some guy in a leather vest playing hero." "They're not going anywhere," Duke said. He stepped forward, unhurried, and placed himself square between the man and the open bus door, his broad frame filling the space like a wall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Something in the set of his shoulders, the flat calm in his eyes, said everything that needed saying. "Not one kid steps off this bus," Duke said quietly. "Not until I know exactly who you are." The man's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted toward the tree line, then back to Duke, then to the van behind him, like he was doing math in his head and not liking the answer. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," Duke said. "We'll let the police sort that out." He turned, slow and deliberate, and walked back toward his Harley. He didn't rush. Rushing would have told the man something, would have shown a crack he could use. Duke's boots crunched against the gravel shoulder, steady as a clock ticking. He swung his leg over the bike, fired the engine, and the deep growl of it rolled out across the empty highway like thunder rolling in from a long way off. He walked the bike backward, then angled it hard across both lanes of Route 9, right behind the van. There wasn't room for a car to squeeze past on either side, not with the ditch running along the shoulder and the guardrail hugging the other. He killed the engine and swung off, planting his boots in the dirt, arms crossed over his chest. Now nobody was going anywhere. Not the van, not the man, not until Duke said so. The delivery man watched him do it, and something shifted in his face. The nervous smile was gone completely now. What replaced it was harder, uglier, a look that reminded Duke of every cornered animal he'd ever seen, the kind that stops thinking about escape and starts thinking about what it can hurt on the way down. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the man said. His voice had dropped low, all pretense of friendliness burned away. "You think this is a game? You think you can just park your bike in the road and play sheriff?" "I think," Duke said, "that a man delivering packages doesn't usually get this worked up over somebody blocking a road." "You're interfering with authorized business." The man's hand drifted toward his jacket, hovering there, not quite committing. "You understand what that means? There's people who don't take kindly to that. People who'll make sure you regret sticking your nose in where it doesn't belong. That a threat? Take it however you want." Duke didn't move, didn't blink. 15 years of hard living had taught him how to read a man's hands, how to watch the shoulders instead of the mouth, because mouths lied, but bodies didn't. This man's shoulders were tight, coiled, his weight rocking slightly onto the balls of his feet like he was deciding between two bad choices: run or fight. Duke had seen that look on 100 faces in 100 parking lots outside bars that didn't ask questions. It never ended well for anybody, but Duke had learned long ago that standing still, staying calm, was the only thing that ever talked a man like this down from the ledge. Inside the bus, the fear had found its way to the surface. The girl in the pink jacket started crying first, a thin, frightened sound that cut through the quiet like glass breaking. Then another voice joined hers, and another, until half the bus was sniffling and sobbing, kids clutching backpacks to their chests, eyes wide and darting between the stranger and the big man in leather blocking the road. "Hey." Duke's voice softened, but only for the children, only enough for them to hear the difference. He didn't turn from the man, kept his eyes locked on him, but he pitched his words toward the open bus door. "Nobody's gonna hurt you, you hear me? Just stay in your seats. Everything's gonna be just fine." It didn't stop the crying. If anything, it seemed to make it worse, like his words had confirmed there was something to be afraid of in the first place. Walter, still frozen behind the wheel, made a strangled sound, his hand twitching against his chest, eyes wet and pleading, locked on Duke like he was the only solid thing left in a world that had gone sideways. The delivery man's hand crept another inch toward his jacket. Duke saw the hand move that final inch, and something in him went very quiet and very clear, the way it always did when things were about to turn bad. He didn't step back. He stepped forward. "Hands where I can see them," Duke said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It came out low and flat and heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. "Right now." The man froze, half his hand still buried in his jacket. His eyes flicked to Duke's face, searching for some kind of bluff, some crack he could exploit. He didn't find one. Duke kept walking, closing the gap between them one slow step at a time, close enough now that he could see the sweat beading along the man's hairline, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. Duke didn't look away from him, not even for a second, but his voice dropped again, softer this time, aimed sideways toward the open door of the bus. "The little one in the front row," he said. "Pink jacket. Come on now, real slow, walk yourself to the back of the bus for me." The girl didn't move at first. She was frozen, same as Walter, tears streaking down her cheeks, her small hands white-knuckled around the straps of her backpack. "You can do it," Duke said, still not looking at her, still watching the man's hands. "Just walk on back there with your friends, that's all. Nice and slow." Something in his tone must have reached her, because she slid out of her seat and started shuffling backward down the narrow aisle, her eyes never leaving the stranger by the door. Other kids shifted to make room for her, pulling her in among them like she was one of their own being folded back into a flock. The man's hand was still frozen inside his jacket. Duke was close now, close enough that if the man pulled something out, there wouldn't be much time to react. But Duke had made his peace with that risk the second he'd swung his bike across the road. He'd made his peace with worse, a long time ago, back when he was younger, and had nothing left to lose. He had plenty to lose now. He stood there anyway. "You don't want to do this," Duke said quietly. "Whatever's in that jacket, you don't want to pull it out. Not here. Not with all these kids watching." The man's throat worked. His eyes darted past Duke, toward the empty highway, toward the tree line, toward anywhere that wasn't this moment. Duke could see him doing the math again, faster this time, the numbers piling up against him. A biker blocking the road. A bus full of witnesses. No way out that didn't end with things getting a whole lot worse. That's when the sound reached them. Faint at first, so faint Duke almost thought he'd imagined it, carried on the wind from somewhere far down Route 9. A siren, then another, layering over the first, growing louder by the second. A car had slowed on the opposite shoulder, a dusty sedan that had pulled up sometime during the standoff without Duke noticing. The window rolled down, and a woman leaned out, phone still pressed to her ear. "Police are on their way!" she shouted across the road. "I called it in when I saw the bus stopped. They're almost here!" Something broke in the man's face. The calculation was over. Whatever plan he'd had, whatever nerve had been holding him together, it snapped all at once, and Duke watched the transformation happen in real time, watched fear finally win out over whatever twisted resolve had brought him here in the first place. The man yanked his hand free of his jacket, empty, and took one stumbling step backward, then another. His eyes swept the tree line at the edge of the road, the thick wall of pine and brush that ran along the highway's shoulder, and Duke knew exactly what he was thinking a half second before he did it. The man turned and ran. He didn't look back. He sprinted off the shoulder, boots pounding against the gravel, and plunged into the trees, branches snapping and swallowing him whole within seconds, leaving the van sitting there empty and abandoned in the road, its engine still idling, hazards still blinking their slow, useless rhythm into the afternoon light. Duke made it 3 steps before he stopped himself. Every muscle in his body wanted to keep going, wanted to chase that man down into the trees and finish what had almost started. 15 years ago, he might have done just that. But he wasn't that man anymore. He had a bus full of children behind him, and an old man in the driver's seat who looked like he might stop breathing altogether if somebody didn't get to him soon. Duke turned around. "Let him go," he said, mostly to himself, and jogged back toward the bus. The kids were crying now, most of them. the fear finally catching up to their small bodies now that the danger had run off into the woods. The girl in the pink jacket was sobbing into the shoulder of another kid, and a boy near the back was saying, "He's gone, he's gone, he's gone," over and over like it was a prayer. "Hey," Duke said, climbing up onto the bottom step of the bus. He kept his voice gentle now, all the flat hardness gone out of it. "Hey, look at me. You're all okay. Nobody's going to hurt you. That man is gone, and he's not coming back." A few of the kids looked up at him. He didn't look like the kind of man who said comforting things. He looked like the kind of man who showed up in nightmares, all leather and ink and gray beard, but something in his voice must have carried through, because a few of the smaller ones stopped crying quite so hard. "You did so good," Duke said, looking at the girl who'd walked to the back of the bus. "You did exactly right. I'm real proud of you." She hiccuped a little sob and nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. Duke turned his attention to Walter. The old man was still frozen in the driver's seat, his hands locked around the wheel like they'd been welded there, his face the color of old paper. His lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. "Hey, old-timer," Duke said, crouching down so he was eye level with him. "You're all right. You did good, too. You kept these kids safe as long as you could. It's over now." Walter's eyes met his, and something flickered there. Something Duke didn't have time to name, because that's when the sirens finally arrived in full. 2 police cruisers came tearing down Route 9, lights spinning red and blue against the gray afternoon sky, and skidded to a stop behind the abandoned van. Doors flew open, officers spilled out, hands on their belts, eyes sweeping the scene, taking in the school bus, the motorcycle blocking the road, the empty van with its engine still running and hazards still blinking. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," one of them called out to Duke. But another officer, older, with sergeant's stripes, held up a hand. "That's fine, Pete. He's not the problem. Look at the kids." Within minutes, the scene turned into a swirl of activity. Officers moved through the bus, checking on the children one by one, calling for paramedics, wrapping Walter in a blanket someone had pulled from a cruiser's trunk. Duke stood off to the side, arms crossed, answering questions from a young officer with a notepad who kept glancing nervously at the patches on his vest. "So the suspect just ran off into the woods," the officer said. "Which direction?" "Northeast," Duke said. "Toward the ridge." He didn't have a description of himself that means much. Dark jacket, brown hair, medium build. But that van's not going anywhere. Might want to run the plates. The officer nodded and jogged back toward the van, leaning into his shoulder radio, rattling off the plate number to dispatch. Duke watched him from a distance, still keeping half an eye on the bus, on Walter being helped down the steps by the 2 paramedics, on the kids being handed off one by one to officers who walked them toward the cruisers to wait for their parents. It was maybe 5 minutes later when the young officer came jogging back, and Duke noticed right away that something had changed in his face. The nervous energy from before was gone, replaced by something tighter, grayer. "Sir," the officer said, stopping in front of Duke, his notepad forgotten in his hand. "That van, it's not registered to any delivery company." "No?" Duke said. The officer shook his head slowly, like he could barely believe the words coming out of his own mouth. "It's registered to a woman named Carol Jennings," he said. "She was reported missing 3 weeks ago, neighboring county over." A cold, heavy stillness settled into Duke's chest, spreading outward like ice water through his veins. Duke's mind was still turning over the name Carol Jennings, still trying to fit the pieces into some kind of shape that made sense, when a strange sound came from behind him. Not a word exactly, more like a breath that had been trapped somewhere for a long time and had finally found a way out. He turned. Walter was standing between the two paramedics, wrapped in that scratchy gray blanket, his legs looking like they might give out any second. But his eyes were locked on Duke, wide and wet, and his hand shot out with a strength that seemed impossible for a man who looked so frail. His fingers closed around Duke's forearm. "Dukey," Walter said. His voice cracked right down the middle of the word. "Dukey, is that really you?" Duke went still. Nobody had called him that in more than 20 years. Nobody alive, anyway. It was a name from somewhere so far back in his memory that hearing it now felt like getting hit by something he couldn't see coming. A name that belonged to a person he'd worked very hard to leave behind on the side of some highway a long time ago. "I'm sorry," Duke said carefully, gently pulling his arm back, not out of anger, but out of confusion. "I think you've got me mixed up with somebody else." But Walter wouldn't let go. If anything, his grip tightened, and the paramedic beside him shot Duke a worried look, like he was trying to decide whether this was a medical emergency or something else entirely. "No," Walter said, shaking his head hard enough that the blanket slipped off one shoulder. "No, I know that face, I know those eyes. You used to look at me the same way back then, like you were trying to figure out if I was going to hurt you." Duke felt something cold slide down his spine. "Sir," he said slowly, "I don't know you. I've never met you before today." "You don't remember me," Walter said. It wasn't a question. It was like he already understood, already expected it, and somehow that made it worse instead of better. Tears were sliding freely down the old man's weathered cheeks now, cutting through the gray dust of the day. That's all right, son. You were just a boy, a scared, hungry boy." The word son landed somewhere deep in Duke's chest, someplace he didn't like people touching. "I think you need to sit down," Duke said, glancing at the paramedic. "Let them look at you. You've been through a lot today." "I was a police officer," Walter said, ignoring him completely, his voice shaking but growing steadier with every word, like something long buried was finally being allowed to come up for air. 30 years ago, younger than you are now, I used to walk a beat downtown, over by the old railroad bridge on 3rd Street. Duke's jaw tightened. He knew that bridge. He knew it the way a person knows a scar on their own body, something they don't look at directly but always know is there. "There was a boy who used to sleep under that bridge," Walter said. 16 years old, skinny as a rail, hadn't eaten in days from the look of him, had a black eye that hadn't healed right, and eyes that looked like they belonged to somebody twice his age. Duke's mouth had gone dry. His hand, without him telling it to, had stopped trying to pull away from Walter's grip. "I could have arrested him," Walter went on, his voice barely above a whisper now. The sirens and the parents and the crying children around them fading into some kind of distant hum. "Vagrancy, trespassing, plenty of reasons on paper. But I looked at that boy, and I didn't see a criminal. I saw somebody's son who needed somebody to see him." Walter's grip on Duke's arm loosened, not out of weakness now, but like he no longer needed to hold on so tight, like he'd finally said the thing he'd been carrying for 30 years. "I took him to a shelter instead," Walter said. "Checked on him every week after that for years. Watched him get stronger. Watched him disappear one day and never come back, and I never knew what happened to him. I never knew if he made it." Duke stood frozen on the side of that highway, the flashing lights washing red and blue across both their faces, and found that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had absolutely no words at all. The garage office smelled like it always did, motor oil and old coffee, but this morning nothing about it felt familiar. Duke sat behind his desk with a stack of invoices in front of him, a pen in his hand, and he hadn't written a single word in 20 minutes. His eyes kept drifting to the small television on the shelf across the room. Big Mike had set it up years ago so Duke could catch the weather before long rides, and now it was playing the local morning news for the third time that hour, the same footage looping over and over. A reporter stood on Route 9, wind messing up her hair, pointing back toward the spot where the bus had been parked. Authorities say the quick actions of a local man prevented what could have been a tragedy, the reporter said. The van has been confirmed to belong to Carol Jennings, a woman reported missing 3 weeks ago from Hartwell County. Police are asking anyone with information to come forward. They didn't say Duke's name. Not yet. But it was only a matter of time, and he knew it, and the thought of it sat in his stomach like a stone. He set the pen down. His hand was shaking a little, and that bothered him more than anything else that had happened in the last 24 hours. Duke Marsh didn't shake. He hadn't shaken during the standoff on the highway, hadn't shaken when the man reached into his jacket, hadn't shaken watching a stranger disappear into the tree line. But sitting here now, alone with his coffee going cold, he couldn't stop his hands from trembling. Dookie. Nobody called him that. Nobody had called him that since he was 16 years old. Since before he understood what it meant to build a life out of nothing. Since before the leather vest and the garage and the 15 years of careful, quiet discipline he'd stacked on top of himself, like bricks. He closed his eyes, and for just a second the office fell away. He was under the bridge again. He could feel the cold concrete against his back, smell the damp air off the river, hear the trains rattling overhead late at night when sleep wouldn't come. He could feel his own ribs through his shirt, feel the ache under his eye that never really healed right. He remembered being hungry in a way that wasn't like being hungry for lunch. It was a hunger that lived in his bones. He remembered a police officer crouching down in front of him. Young face, kind eyes. A voice that didn't sound like it was about to arrest him. The memory was blurry, worn down at the edges the way old photographs get when you handle them too much. Or maybe the way memories get when a person spends 30 years trying not to look at them. But it was there. It had always been there, buried under everything else. Waiting. Duke opened his eyes. Big Mike knocked twice on the doorframe and let himself in without waiting for an answer, the way he always did. He had 2 cups of coffee in his hands and a look on his face that said he already knew something was wrong. "You didn't sleep," Big Mike said. It wasn't a question. "No," Duke admitted. Big Mike set one of the coffees down on the desk and dropped into the chair across from him, his big frame making the old chair creak. "That old man, the bus driver, he say something to you out there?" Duke looked at the television, at the frozen image of the highway, at the flashing lights that had washed red and blue over both their faces the night before. "He knew me," Duke said quietly, "from before." Big Mike didn't ask before what. He just waited, the way he always did when Duke needed a minute, patient as a mountain. "I don't remember him," Duke said. "Not really, just pieces. I've spent a long time trying not to remember any of it." "Maybe it's time you did," Big Mike said. Duke didn't answer right away. He looked down at the stack of unfinished paperwork, at the pen lying useless on top of it, and he thought about Walter's hand gripping his arm, about the tears cutting through the dust on that old man's face, about 30 years of wondering if a scared, hungry boy had made it. He stood up. "He's at Millbrook General," Duke said. "They're keeping him overnight for observation." Big Mike nodded slowly, like he'd expected this. "You want me to come with you?" "No," Duke said, grabbing his keys off the desk. "This one I need to do alone." The hospital was quiet when Duke arrived. The halls washed in that pale fluorescent light that made everyone look tired. He found Walter's room at the end of the corridor, the door half open, and when he stepped inside, Walter was already looking at him, propped up against the pillows, awake and alert despite everything. Their eyes met, and neither of them said a word. Duke pulled the chair closer to the bed, the metal legs scraping against the floor. Walter watched him the whole time, his eyes bright despite the tubes running to his arm and the pale color of his skin against the white hospital sheets. "You came," Walter said, his voice thin but steady. "Said I would." Duke sat down, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together like he didn't know what else to do with them. Walter smiled, and it made the wrinkles around his eyes deepen. "I wasn't sure. Thought maybe you'd want to forget all about an old man rambling on a highway." "I've been trying to forget a lot of things," Duke said quietly. "Guess I'm not as good at it as I thought." Walter studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies something he's waited a very long time to see. Then he reached over to the nightstand beside his bed, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled open the drawer. He rummaged through it for a second, papers rustling, and pulled out a worn manila envelope, its edges soft and rounded from age. "I want to show you something," Walter said. "I've kept this a long time, longer than you'd believe." He opened the envelope with careful fingers, like it held something fragile, and slid out a photograph. The edges were yellowed, the colors faded to soft browns and grays. He held it out to Duke. Duke took it slowly, his breath caught in his chest. It was a boy, 16, maybe. Skinny, all sharp angles and bones, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big for him. His hair was matted down on one side. There was a bruise under his eye, yellow and green at the edges, half-healed. He was standing next to a young police officer in a crisp uniform, and the officer had his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder, like he was afraid the boy might bolt if he let go. The boy wasn't smiling, but he wasn't looking away from the camera either. He was just standing there, like he didn't know what else to do. "That's you," Walter said softly. "That's the day I took you to the shelter on 5th Street. You probably don't remember the picture. A volunteer there took it. Said she wanted a record, in case anybody ever asked what happened to you." Duke's hands were shaking again. He couldn't stop looking at the boy's eyes. There was something there he recognized, something underneath the fear, a kind of stubbornness that refused to fully break. Walter reached into the envelope again and pulled out a stack of newspaper clippings, brittle and soft with age, held together with a rubber band that had gone stiff and cracked. "I kept these too," he said. "Every time your name showed up somewhere, the garage opening, that charity ride you all did for the children's hospital, must be 10 years back now. A little piece about you sponsoring the youth boxing program." He set them down gently on the blanket between them. "I never knew if you'd remember me, but I never stopped wondering what happened to that boy under the bridge." Duke stared at the clippings, at his own name printed in small type, at a life he'd built one careful day at a time, never once imagining that somebody out there had been quietly keeping track of it all. Something cracked open in his chest. "I remember the bridge," Duke said, and his voice came out rough, broken at the edges. "The cold. I remember how the concrete never really warmed up, even in summer because the sun never reached under there. I remember being so hungry I couldn't sleep some nights, and other nights I couldn't sleep because I was too scared of who might find me." He looked up at Walter, and his eyes were wet now, spilling over before he could stop them. "I remember you," Duke said, "crouching down in front of me. You didn't grab me, you didn't yell. You just talked to me like I was a person." "You were a person," Walter said gently. "You were a scared kid who deserved better than what the world was giving you." Duke wiped at his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed and unable to stop the tears anyway. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt too small for what he meant. But he said them anyway. "You saved my life. I don't know if I ever would have made it out from under that bridge without you." Walter reached out and took Duke's hand in both of his grip weaker than it used to be, but no less certain. "Duke," he said, "you saving those children on that bus, becoming the man you are, running that garage, taking care of people, that's not just your redemption." His eyes shone. "That's mine too. Watching you become who you are is the proudest thing I've ever done in my whole life." Duke rode back into Millbrook on a Tuesday morning, and the first thing he saw was the vans. 3 of them, parked crooked along the curb outside Marsh & Sons' garage, with satellite dishes bolted to their roofs and cables running across the parking lot like tangled vines. A woman in a blazer stood in front of a camera, talking fast, gesturing toward the garage bay doors behind her. Another reporter paced near the gas pumps, phone pressed to his ear. Duke slowed his Harley to a crawl, the engine rumbling low, and eased into the lot. Heads turned. The woman in the blazer spotted him first, and her whole face lit up like she'd won something. "That's him! That's Duke Marsh!" They swarmed, microphones shoved toward his face before he'd even gotten his kickstand down. Questions came at him in a jumble, all tangled together. "How did you know something was wrong? What did you say to the suspect? Is it true you used to know the bus driver?" Duke held up one hand, palm out, the way he'd calm a spooked animal, and said nothing until he'd made his way to the garage door. "I got work to do," he said finally, and that was all. He ducked inside and let the door rattle down behind him. Big Mike was already at the counter, arms crossed, shaking his head. "Been like this since sunrise. Phone's been ringing off the hook, too. Some morning show out of the city wants you on live tomorrow." "Not interested," Duke said. "Figured." Mike handed him a rag, and Duke wiped his hands with it even though they weren't dirty yet, just because it gave him something to do. Outside, through the front window, he could see the town moving around the chaos of the news vans like water around a rock. A few people waved at him through the glass, smiling big, giving him a thumbs up. An older man Duke recognized from the hardware store stopped his truck right in the middle of the road, just to roll down his window and shout, "Proud of you, Duke." But not everyone looked at him that way. Mrs. Pemberton from the flower shop crossed to the other side of the street when she saw him step out for a delivery later that afternoon, pulling her granddaughter's hand a little tighter as she went. A man Duke didn't recognize stood by his car in the grocery store parking lot, staring at Duke's vest, at the patches, at the ink running up his forearms, like he was trying to work out whether the man who'd stopped the abduction and the man standing in front of him now were somehow different people. Duke caught his eye and nodded, polite, and the man looked away fast, pretending to check his phone. It stung more than Duke wanted to admit. He'd built a life here, quiet and steady, one repaired engine at a time, one paid bill at a time. He thought he'd earned some kind of place in this town, but apparently a leather vest still meant something different to some folks than 15 years of honest work. By the time the town hall meeting rolled around that Thursday night, called by the school board to talk about safety measures after the incident, Duke almost didn't go. Big Mike talked him into it. "They asked you to be there," Mike said. "Show up. Sit in the back if you want, but show up." So Duke went, sat near the back of the packed gymnasium, arms crossed, listening to the superintendent talk about new protocols and background checks and emergency drills. It was going fine, steady, until a woman near the front stood up during the question period. Duke recognized her vaguely, one of the mothers from the elementary school pickup line. "I just want to ask," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet room, "if it's really appropriate for a member of a motorcycle gang to be spending so much time around our children. I mean, no disrespect. But we don't actually know this man. We know his patch." A ripple went through the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably. A few nodded along with her, quiet murmurs of agreement passing between them like a current under the surface. Duke felt the old shame rise up in his chest, familiar and sour. The same feeling he used to get as a boy when shopkeepers watched him too closely, when teachers assumed the worst before he'd said a word. He kept his face still. He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. He just stood up, quiet as he could manage, and walked out the back door into the cool night air, letting it shut softly behind him. The night air smelled like cut grass and rain that hadn't fallen yet. Duke stood in the school parking lot for a long minute, letting the noise from the gymnasium fade behind him, before he pulled out his phone and called Big Mike. Mike picked up on the second ring. "That bad?" "Woman stood up and called me gang trash in front of half the town," Duke said. His voice was flat, but his jaw was tight enough to ache. "In front of kids, Mike. You want me to come get you?" "No." Duke looked up at the sky, at the thin scatter of stars poking through the clouds. "I want to do something that matters, something nobody can argue with." There was a pause on the line. "You thinking about Carol Jennings?" 3 weeks she's been out there somewhere," Duke said. "Maybe alive, maybe not. Police got their hands full with paperwork and press conferences. Nobody's out walking the back roads. Nobody's checking the old hunting cabins or the barns nobody's used in 20 years. And you think we should. I think we know this county better than any state trooper ever will," Duke said. "Every back road, every abandoned property, every place a man could hide a person. We grew up on these roads, Mike. We fixed half the trucks that drive them." Mike didn't hesitate. "How many guys you want?" "All of them who'll come. Tell them sunrise, at the garage. Tell them to bring water, flashlights, whatever gear they got for rough ground. This isn't a ride, this is work." "I'll make some calls tonight," Mike said. "You know Tiny's gonna want to bring that dog of his." "Good. We'll take every nose and every pair of eyes we can get." Duke ended the call and stood there a moment longer, feeling something settle in his chest that hadn't been there in days. Not pride, exactly. Just purpose. Something clean and simple after a night of feeling small and judged. He got on his bike and rode home through the dark, and for the first time since the reporters showed up, he slept without his mind circling. He woke before his alarm, dressed in his work clothes, and was at the garage by 5:30, going over a hand-drawn map of the county he'd sketched on a piece of butcher paper. He'd marked every dirt road, every old farmhouse he could remember standing empty, every hunting cabin whose owners had moved away or passed on. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By 6:15, he heard them coming before he saw them. The low rumble of a dozen engines rolling in together, filling the quiet morning air like a wave building offshore. One by one, the bikes turned into the garage lot, headlights cutting through the gray early light. Big Mike led the pack, and behind him came faces Duke had known for years, some for decades. Tiny, built like a refrigerator, had his old bloodhound Duchess riding in a sidecar, ears flapping. Sully, missing 3 fingers from a shop accident years back, nodded at Duke as he cut his engine. Even Frank Delgado showed up, a man who hadn't been to a group ride in over a year since his wife got sick. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They just gathered around the hood of Duke's truck, where he'd spread out the map, waited down at the corners with wrenches, and listened. "We're splitting into 4 teams, Duke said, tracing lines with his finger. "Mike, you take Route 9 north up past the quarry. Sully, you and Frank take the old logging roads out by Miller's Creek. Tiny, you and Duchess start at the abandoned Henderson place and work east." He looked up at the rest of them. 12 grown men who'd been called thugs and outlaws by half this town, more times than any of them could count, standing there ready to spend their day searching briar patches and rotted barns for a woman none of them had ever met. Anybody sees anything at all, you call it in. We're not heroes today. We're just extra eyes. A cruiser rolled into the lot just then, and Detective Ruiz stepped out, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between doubt and reluctant curiosity as she took in the sight of a dozen bikers standing shoulder to shoulder around a hand-drawn map, gearing up to search the county at sunrise. Detective Ruiz didn't stop them. She stood there a long moment, arms crossed, watching Duke fold up the butcher paper map. And finally she said, "Call me before you do anything, not after." Duke nodded, and that was that. She got back in her cruiser and followed them out of the lot, and for once, nobody argued about who was in charge. The morning stretched into a long, hot day. Duke rode with Big Mike along Route 9, stopping at every gas station, every diner, every run-down truck stop they passed. They showed Carol Jennings's photo to anyone who'd look at it, an old picture the police had released, her smiling in front of a Christmas tree, dark hair, a gap in her front teeth. Most people shook their heads. A few squinted at it for a long time before saying, "No, sorry, wish I could help." A woman at a gas station out past Miller's Creek started crying when she looked at the photo. Said she had a daughter about that age, and Duke had to look away for a second before he could keep talking. By early afternoon, his shirt was soaked through with sweat, and his voice was going hoarse from asking the same questions over and over. Tiny called in around 1 to say Duchess had picked up a scent near the Henderson place, but lost it at a creek bed. Sully and Frank had nothing to report from the logging roads, except a family of raccoons and a rusted-out car that had been sitting in the woods so long a tree was growing through the hood. Duke's phone rang around 2, right as he was climbing back on his bike outside a truck stop that smelled like fry oil and diesel. He almost didn't answer it, but he saw Walter's name on the screen and picked up anyway. "How's it going out there?" Walter's voice was thin but steady. "Slow," Duke admitted. "Lot of no's so far. Lot of people looking at that picture like they want to help but got nothing to give." "That's how it goes," Walter said. "I remember cases like this. You knock on 20 doors expecting nothing, and the 21st one cracks it wide open. You just gotta keep knocking." Duke leaned against his bike, watching a truck pull out of the lot, gravel crunching under its tires. "You doing okay? You sound tired." "I'm an old man, Dukey. I'm always tired." There was a smile in his voice, though, the kind that made Duke smile too, even after a day like this one. "You're doing good work out there. Whatever happens today, you remember that. You didn't have to do this. Nobody would have blamed you for staying home after last night." "Somebody's got to do it," Duke said. "Somebody is," Walter said. "And I'm proud of him." Duke didn't know what to say to that, so he just said he'd call later, and hung up, and sat there a moment with the phone warm in his hand, feeling something in his chest loosen just slightly, like a knot coming undone. The sun was low and orange by the time Duke and Mike pulled into a diner called the Wagon Wheel, a squat building with a flickering neon sign sitting at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by gravel and a few parked semis. Inside, the place smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease. A handful of truckers sat scattered at the counter and in booths, and Duke went from table to table with the photo, same as he had all day, expecting the same tired shake of the head. He was about to give up on the place when an older trucker in a faded flannel shirt, sitting alone in the back booth with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him, looked at the photo for a long moment, then up at Duke, his eyes narrowing. "That's her, the missing woman from the news." He tapped the photo with a thick finger. "And they said the fella they're looking for, some drifter, matches a description. Skinny guy, nervous, can't hold eye contact?" "That's him," Duke said, his pulse picking up. "There was a guy like that used to hang around an old hunting cabin off Route 9, back a ways, maybe 5-6 years ago." Ray something. Tillman, I think. Used to buy gas from the station up the road. Never talked much. Always looked like he was running from something. The trucker shrugged. Ain't seen him in years, but that cabin's still out there, far as I know. Nobody's used it since Old Man Purdy died. Duke felt something click into place, sharp and certain. Can you tell us where? The trucker drew them a rough map on a napkin, his thick fingers smudging the ink as he traced the route. Route 9 north, past the old feed store, then a left onto a gravel road that wasn't marked anymore because the sign had rotted off years back. Follow that for 2 miles, and the cabin would be sitting back in the trees, half swallowed by brush. Duke thanked him, folded the napkin like it was made of gold, and he and Big Mike were back on their bikes before the man had even finished his cold coffee. They called Ruiz from the parking lot. Duke laid it all out, the trucker's story, the name Tillman, the cabin nobody had used in years. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Duke wondered if the call had dropped. That's a second-hand tip from a stranger in a diner, Ruiz finally said. I can't roll a tactical team out on that alone. I know how it sounds, Duke said, but it's the first thing all day that's felt real. Everything else has been a dead end. Another pause. Duke could hear papers shuffling on her end, like she was pulling something up on a desk. There's an old property record for a J. Purdy off a gravel access road north of Miller's Creek, Ruiz said slowly. Matches the general area you're talking about. Tax records show it's been vacant since he passed 6 years ago. She let out a breath. All right, we'll check it out. But this is a police operation, Marsh. You and your people stay back. Way back, I mean it. Understood, Duke said. And he meant it, even though something in him wanted to argue, wanted to be the one to kick down that cabin door. But he thought of Carol Jennings' picture, the gap in her teeth, the little tree behind her in the photo, and he swallowed the urge down. This wasn't about him. We go at first light, Ruiz said. I want a full team. I want it done right. And I don't want anybody getting hurt because we rushed in the dark on a hunch. You and your boys can follow at a distance. That's the deal. That's the deal, Duke agreed. He hung up and looked at Big Mike, who was leaning against his bike with his arms crossed, watching Duke's face like he already knew the answer. First light, Duke said. Mike nodded slow. Then I guess we get some sleep. Neither one of them slept much. Duke lay in his bed that night staring at the ceiling, running the trucker's words over and over in his head. The cabin, the name Tillman, the years it had sat empty in the woods. He thought about Carol Jennings somewhere out there, maybe still alive, maybe not, and the not knowing sat on his chest like a stone. He thought about Walter, too, about the phone call, about somebody being proud of him. He hadn't heard those words in a long time, not about anything real. By 4 a.m, he gave up on sleep altogether and made coffee in the dark kitchen, standing at the counter, looking out the window at nothing. The sky was still gray, barely lit at the edges, when Duke and his crew gathered at the edge of Route 9, where the gravel road broke off into the trees. Tiny was there with Duchess, the dog already alert, ears up, sensing something in the cool morning air. Sully and Frank sat on their bikes a little ways off, quiet for once. No jokes, no chatter. Big Mike pulled up beside Duke and gave him a nod. Ruiz arrived a few minutes later with 3 cruisers and an unmarked van, her face set and serious in the pale light. She walked over to Duke, looked him dead in the eye. You stay back like we talked about. You hear gunfire, you do not run toward it. You call it in and you wait. Understood, Duke said again. And this time he really did mean to try. The convoy pulled out just as the first real light broke over the tree line, gold and thin, catching on the dew still sitting on the grass along the shoulder. Duke fell in behind the last cruiser, his engine rumbling low and steady beneath him. the gravel road stretching out ahead into the trees like a tunnel of shadow and light. He hadn't felt anything like this in years, not since before the garage, before the routines and the quiet nights alone with a wrench in his hand. This was something older, something that had been sitting dormant in him since he was young. Purpose. Real purpose. Riding shoulder to shoulder with men and women who trusted him now. Chasing something that mattered. The wind picked up as they rode deeper into the trees, and Duke leaned into it, his heart steady, his hands sure on the handlebars, carrying him toward whatever waited at the end of that gravel road. The gravel road gave out about a mile in, choked off by roots and fallen branches that hadn't been cleared in years. Ruiz called a stop, and the cruisers idled in a rough line behind the van, headlights cutting weak beams through the morning fog. "This is as far as the vehicles go," she said, stepping out and pulling a radio from her belt. "We're on foot from here." Duke swung off his bike and felt the ground shift under his boots, soft with old leaves and mud from a rain that must have fallen days back. Big Mike came up beside him, already studying the tree line like he was reading a language only he understood. 2 miles, the trucker said, Duke murmured, unfolding the napkin map one more time, even though he'd memorized every smudge on it by now. "Should be northeast of here, past a creek bend." Ruiz organized her team quick and quiet, hand signals mostly, the kind of practiced silence that came from doing this more times than anyone would want to. She looked over at Duke and Mike, then at Tiny standing off to the side with Duchess straining gentle against her leash, nose already working the air. "Your dog good at this?" Ruiz asked. "Best there is," Tiny said, and there wasn't a shred of doubt in his voice. "Then she's on point with my lead officer. Everybody else falls in behind, nice and slow. Nobody talks unless it matters." They moved into the trees single file, boots sinking into the soft ground, branches reaching low and catching on jacket sleeves. The fog hung thick between the trunks, turning the woods into something half real, shapes appearing and disappearing as they walked. Duke kept his eyes moving, scanning left and right the way he used to scan a room full of strangers, looking for anything that didn't belong. A broken branch, a boot print in the mud. Anything. Big Mike walked beside him, quiet, steady, his big shoulders set like a man carrying more weight than just his own body. Every now and then he'd glance at Duke, checking, the way old friends did without needing words for it. "You holding up?" Mike finally asked, voice low. "I'm fine," Duke said. "You don't look fine. You look like a man about to walk into his own nightmare." Duke didn't answer right away. The trees pressed in close around them, and somewhere far off a bird called out, sharp and sudden, making more than one person flinch. "I keep thinking about her," Duke said finally. "Carol, 3 weeks out here, if she's even still—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Mike put a hand on his shoulder, just for a second. Just enough. "We're close. I can feel it." They pushed on, the ground rising slightly, the trees thinning just enough to let more of the pale morning light through. Duchess picked up her pace ahead of them, nose low, tail stiff and alert, and the lead officer holding her leash raised a fist in the air. Everyone froze. Ruiz moved up quiet, crouching beside the officer, and Duke watched her scan the tree line with narrow eyes. He followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop clean through the ground. There it was. Through a break in the trees, half swallowed by brush and years of neglect, sat the cabin. Its roof sagged in the middle like a tired old animal, the wood siding gray and split, one window boarded over with a warped sheet of plywood. No smoke from the chimney. No sound at all. Not even birds this close, like the whole clearing was holding its breath. Ruiz raised a hand, fingers spread, and pressed it down slow. Everyone dropped lower, moving into a crouch, spreading out along the tree line without a word between them. She looked back once, found Duke's eyes, and gave him a single, sharp nod, the kind that said, "Stay put, stay ready, stay quiet." Duke's heart hammered hard against his ribs. Every instinct in his body wanted to move, wanted to run straight for that door and tear it off its hinges with his bare hands. But he held still, crouched low in the brush beside Big Mike, watching the cabin, waiting for Ruiz's signal to close the distance. Ruiz gave the signal, and 4 officers moved forward in a crouch, guns drawn, spreading out to cover the front door and the 2 windows. Duke's whole body wanted to follow, but he made himself stay low in the brush beside Big Mike, hands curled into fists against his knees. "Police! Anyone inside, come out with your hands up!" Nothing. Just the fog drifting through the clearing and the soft creak of the cabin settling in the morning cold. One officer kicked the door open. It swung back hard, banging against the inside wall, and 3 of them poured in fast, flashlights cutting through the dark. Duke counted his own heartbeats, slow and heavy, waiting. "Clear," someone called from inside. Then a pause. "Clear." Again from another room. Ruiz straightened up and waved the rest of them forward. Duke was moving before Mike could stop him, boots eating up the wet ground, and he stepped through the busted door into a room that smelled like mold and old smoke and something worse underneath it, something like fear that had soaked into the walls. There was a mattress on the floor, stained and thin, a chair with rope still tied to one leg, empty cans scattered in a corner, some rusted, some newer. Whoever had been here, they'd been here a while. But no Carol. No sign of her at all except a single shoe, small and pink, lying on its side near the mattress like it had been kicked off in a struggle. Duke's stomach turned over. He looked at Ruiz, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something like fear cross her face, too, quick and gone. "Check the outbuildings," she barked. "Spread out. She could be anywhere." They fanned out through the clearing, checking a rotted shed, an old outhouse leaning sideways, the underside of a rusted truck with no wheels. Nothing. Duchess strained at her leash, circling, whining low in her throat, confused by too many old scents crossing each other. Duke walked around the back of the cabin, past a woodpile collapsed in on itself, past a tangle of blackberry brambles thick enough to swallow a man whole. His boots caught on something, a soft give in the ground that didn't match the hard-packed dirt around it. He stopped. He crouched down and brushed away a layer of dead leaves and broken branches, the kind that looked scattered on purpose, not by wind. Underneath, the ground was darker, disturbed, like it had been dug up and packed back down more than once. "Mike," Duke said, and something in his voice brought Big Mike running. Together they cleared away more debris, tossing branches aside until they found it. A wooden door, flat against the ground, half rotted, with a rusted iron ring bolted to the top. A root cellar. "Ruiz!" Duke shouted, and his voice cracked on it. "Over here!" Ruiz sprinted around the cabin with 2 officers behind her. She dropped to her knees beside the door, pressing her ear against the wood. "Carol Jennings, my name is Detective Ruiz, Millbrook Police," she called out, loud and clear. "If you can hear me, make a sound. We're here to help you." For a long moment, nothing. Then, so faint Duke almost thought he imagined it, a soft thump came from beneath the door. Then another. "She's in there," Ruiz breathed. "Get this open now." Duke didn't wait for tools. He grabbed the iron ring with both hands and pulled, muscles straining, boots digging into the mud for purchase. The wood groaned, swollen with years of rain, refusing to give. Big Mike dropped down beside him, wrapping his hands around Duke's, and together they hauled back with everything they had. The door tore loose with a crack of splintering wood, and cold, damp air rushed up from the darkness below. There, huddled on the dirt floor of the cellar, wrapped in a filthy blanket, was a young woman. Her hair hung matted around a face gone pale and hollow, cheekbones sharp with days of hunger, lips cracked and trembling. But her eyes were open, wide and wet, blinking up into the sudden light like she couldn't believe it was real. "Carol," Ruiz said gently, kneeling at the edge of the opening. "It's over. You're safe now." The young woman made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and reached up a shaking hand. Duke climbed down into the cellar without a second thought, careful of the crumbling dirt walls, and gathered her up in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. She was so light it frightened him, bones close beneath thin skin, her whole body trembling with cold and relief all at once. "I've got you," he murmured. "I've got you. You're okay." He carried her up out of the darkness and into the pale morning sunlight breaking through the fog, and Carol Jennings buried her face against his shoulder and wept, her whole body shaking with sobs that had been 3 weeks in the making. By the time the sun came up over Millbrook, everybody in town knew what had happened out at that cabin in the woods. The story spread the way stories do in small towns, fast and loud, growing a little bigger with each telling. By breakfast, the diner on Main Street was packed with people talking over eggs and coffee about the bikers who found Carol Jennings alive. By lunch, the local news van was parked outside the police station, and a reporter was asking Detective Ruiz questions with a microphone shoved close to her face. By dinner, somebody had already put up a hand-painted sign outside the hardware store that said, "Welcome home, Carol," in big blue letters. Duke didn't want any part of the attention. He went back to the garage the next morning like it was any other day, pulled on his coveralls, and buried himself under the hood of a Chevy pickup that needed a new alternator. But the phone at the front desk wouldn't stop ringing, and Big Mike kept poking his head in from the office with that grin on his face, telling Duke about another reporter, another neighbor, another person who wanted to shake his hand. "You're famous, brother," Mike said, leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Whole town's talking about you." "Whole town used to cross the street when they saw me coming," Duke muttered, not looking up from the engine. "Yeah, well," Mike shrugged. "Funny how finding a missing girl changes people's minds." Duke didn't answer that. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. This sudden warmth from people who'd looked at him like a threat just days before. It didn't sit right in his chest, not yet. Trust, real trust, wasn't something that showed up overnight just because of one good thing. He'd learned that a long time ago. But the calls kept coming. And on Thursday afternoon, Principal Donna Whitfield from Millbrook Elementary called the garage herself, her voice bright and a little nervous, asking if Duke would consider coming to speak at the school's safety fair that weekend. They wanted to talk to the kids about staying alert, about trusting their gut when something felt wrong. They wanted to talk about heroes. "I ain't no hero," Duke said into the phone, gripping it a little too tight. "Mr. Marsh," Donna said gently. "You saved those children on that bus. You helped save Carol Jennings. The kids look up to you. Some of their parents didn't understand before. Now they do. Please, just say a few words. That's all we're asking." Duke sat there a long moment, the phone warm against his ear, thinking about all the years he'd spent being looked at with suspicion, being judged before anyone gave him a chance. And now here was somebody asking him to stand up in front of a whole school and be seen as something good. "All right," he finally said. "I'll do it." The days leading up to the fair moved slow and fast all at once. Duke found himself pacing the garage at night, rehearsing words in his head that never sounded right out loud. He wasn't a man built for speeches. He was a man built for quiet, steady action, not standing in front of a crowd with everybody's eyes on him. When the morning of the safety fair finally came, Duke put on a clean shirt under his leather vest, combed his beard down flat, and rode his Harley to the school with his stomach twisted into knots tighter than any bolt he'd ever turned. The gymnasium was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched from wall to wall, filled with kids in bright shirts and parents holding coffee cups, teachers standing along the edges with clipboards. A banner hung above the stage that read, "Millbrook Safety Fair," in big red letters, right next to a smaller sign someone had made that simply said, "Thank you, Duke." He spotted Walter near the front, sitting in a folding chair with a cane propped against his knee, wearing a cardigan sweater and a smile that made Duke's chest ache in the best way. When Principal Whitfield called his name, the gymnasium erupted into applause, kids clapping and cheering, parents standing up from their seats. Duke walked up to the small stage, his boots heavy on the wooden steps, and stood behind the microphone with his hands gripping the edges of the podium like it was the only thing holding him up. He looked out at all those faces, waiting for him to speak, and for the first time in his whole life, Duke Marsh felt like he belonged somewhere. "I ain't much for speeches," he started, his voice rough but steady. "But I want to tell you kids something important. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't ever be afraid to speak up, even if the grown-up telling you different seems friendly." The room stayed quiet, hanging on every word. A week later, the schoolyard at Millbrook Elementary looked nothing like it usually did. Instead of empty blacktop and quiet swing sets, there were folding tables set up in long rows, each one covered with a bright paper banner. One table had a big cutout of a stop sign. Another had a police car parked right next to it, lights off but doors open, so kids could climb inside and sit behind the wheel. Balloons were tied to every fence post, red and blue and yellow, bouncing gently in the breeze. Duke stood near the far end of the yard, helping Big Mike set up a table with bicycle helmets lined up in neat rows. Behind them, 5 other members of Duke's chapter had come out to help too, all of them wearing their leather vests. But today, nobody flinched at the sight of them. Kids ran up asking to sit on their motorcycles parked along the curb, and the bikers laughed and lifted small children up onto the seats, snapping pictures with proud parents standing close by. "Never thought I'd see the day," Big Mike said, grinning as he handed a helmet to a little girl with pigtails. "Us angels running a safety fair." "Times change," Duke said, though he still felt a little strange about it, like he was wearing a coat that didn't quite fit yet. But it was a good strange. A strange he was getting used to. Detective Ruiz walked over from the police booth, holding a cup of lemonade somebody had handed her. "Quite a turnout," she said, looking around at the crowd. Kids were laughing near the bounce house set up by the PTA. Parents chatted in clusters, some holding babies on their hips. The smell of popcorn drifted from a cart near the school entrance. "Yeah," Duke said. "Nice to see the town smiling for once instead of whispering." Ruiz gave him a small smile. "Give it time. People don't forget fast, but they do come around. You proved that." Walter was there too, sitting in a folding chair someone had set up in the shade of a big oak tree, a cardigan draped over his shoulders even though the day was warm. Kids from his old bus route kept coming up to say hello, some of them hugging him around the middle before running off again. He caught Duke's eye from across the yard and gave him a small wave, his face full of quiet pride. Duke waved back, feeling that same ache in his chest he'd felt at the assembly, that strange mix of joy and disbelief, that this was his life now. The afternoon rolled on, easy and warm. Someone set up a small stage near the flagpole, and the school choir sang a couple of songs about being safe and staying smart. Officer Ruiz gave a short talk on bike safety through a microphone that squeaked a little too loud. Kids lined up for face painting, coming away with tiny stars and stripes on their cheeks. It was, in every way, a perfect afternoon. Duke was crouched down, helping a boy adjust the strap on a bicycle helmet when he heard it. A murmur, small at first, rippling through a cluster of parents near the far end of the parking lot. He didn't catch the words, just the tone, sharp and worried, spreading fast the way bad news does. He stood up, scanning the crowd. Big Mike had noticed too, his easy grin fading into something tighter, more alert. "Duke." Mike's voice was low. He nodded toward the parking lot, past the rows of cars glinting in the sun. Duke followed his gaze. Near the tree line at the edge of the lot, half hidden behind a rusted-out pickup truck, stood a man in a gray jacket, hood pulled up despite the warm afternoon. He wasn't moving toward the fair. He was watching it. Watching the crowd of children laughing near the bounce house, watching the parents chatting by the lemonade table, watching like he was looking for something. Or someone. Duke's stomach dropped, a cold weight settling low and hard. He knew that stillness. He'd seen it before, on a lonely stretch of Route 9, in a man who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. "That's him," Duke said quietly, his voice flat and sure. "That's Tillman." Big Mike was already moving, but Duke was faster. "Everybody stay back!" Duke shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the fair like a siren. It was too late. Tillman burst from behind the pickup truck, faster than a man his size should have moved, and he cut straight through a gap in the folding tables toward a little girl standing near the edge of the bounce house line. She was maybe 7 years old, wearing a purple shirt with a butterfly on it, her hair in 2 braids that bounced as she turned to see what the commotion was. "Emma!" a woman's voice screamed. A mother, somewhere in the crowd, her face twisting with horror. Tillman grabbed the girl by the arm before anyone could reach her. She screamed, a high, sharp sound that seemed to freeze the whole schoolyard for one terrible second. Balloons kept bobbing on the fence posts. The choir microphone still squeaked with feedback on the empty stage. And in the middle of all that ordinary brightness, a man in a gray hoodie was dragging a screaming child toward the tree line. Then the world caught up to the moment, and chaos broke loose. Parents screamed. Someone knocked over a table of bicycle helmets, sending them rolling across the blacktop. A woman fainted near the lemonade stand, and 2 others rushed to catch her. Detective Ruiz was already shouting into her radio, sprinting across the yard, her hand going to her hip. Officers near the police car booth abandoned their post, drawing weapons, trying to get an angle without hitting the girl. Duke didn't think. He ran. His boots hit the pavement hard, his heart slamming against his ribs, years of instinct taking over where fear might have stopped a lesser man. Big Mike was right behind him, bellowing at people to clear the path, and the other angels scattered to keep the crowd back, forming a human wall between the panicking parents and the scene unfolding at the tree line. Tillman was fast, but panic made him clumsy. He stumbled once on the curb, and Duke closed the gap, his lungs burning, his mind locked on one single thought. Get to the girl. "Let her go!" Duke roared, closing in as Tillman reached the edge of the schoolyard where the blacktop gave way to grass, and then to a line of scraggly trees marking the property line. Tillman spun, breathing hard, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wild in a way that made him look more animal than man. He yanked the girl's arm, and she screamed again, twisting against his grip, her small sneakers digging into the dirt. "Stay back," Tillman shouted, his voice cracking. "I mean it! Stay back or I swear I'll—" "You're not walking out of here with her," Duke said, his voice low and steady despite the fire roaring through his chest. He kept moving forward, slow, deliberate steps, his hands raised just slightly, not in surrender, but in warning. "It's over, Ray. You know it's over." Something in Tillman's grip loosened, just for a second, whether from exhaustion or the crushing weight of the truth in Duke's words. The girl wrenched her arm free and bolted, sprinting past Duke toward the sound of her mother's voice, still screaming her name somewhere behind them. That was when Tillman's hand went into his jacket. Duke saw the movement, saw the glint of metal as Tillman pulled the weapon free, and every instinct in his body told him to move, to close the distance before Tillman could aim. He lunged forward, but he wasn't fast enough. Tillman surged toward him, weapon raised, rage and desperation twisting his face into something almost unrecognizable. Then, from somewhere behind Duke, a voice cried out, thin and breathless but full of fierce, unshakable will. "No!" Walter came out of nowhere, moving faster than his frail body should have allowed, closing the last few feet between himself and Duke with a strength that seemed impossible for a man his age. He threw himself forward, placing his body directly between Duke and Tillman's outstretched arm, just as the two men collided in a violent, tangled crash of limbs and momentum. The gun clattered to the pavement. Duke saw it spin away, catching the sun for one bright second before it skidded under a folding table. Tillman went down hard, Walter's body still tangled with his, and then the police were there, 3 officers piling on, one wrenching Tillman's arm behind his back, while another pressed a knee into his shoulder blades. Tillman screamed something into the blacktop, but nobody was listening to him anymore. Detective Ruiz was there too, snapping cuffs onto his wrists with a hard, final click, her voice sharp and clear as she called for backup that had already arrived. Duke didn't see any of it. Not really. His eyes were only on Walter. The old man had slid to the ground when the 2 bodies broke apart, and now he lay crumpled on his side in the grass, one hand pressed to his chest, his fingers curled like claws against his shirt. His face had gone the color of ash. His mouth was open, but no sound came out, just short, ragged gasps that didn't seem to be pulling in enough air. "Walter!" Duke dropped to his knees beside him, all the noise of the schoolyard, the screaming, the sirens starting up in the distance, the parents shouting for their children fading into something distant and muffled, like Duke was hearing it all from underwater. All that mattered was the old man in front of him, the man who had once found a scared 16-year-old boy sleeping under a bridge and had never, not once, stopped believing in him. "Walter, hey, look at me." Duke's hands hovered over him, unsure where to touch, afraid of hurting him further. "Come on, old man, stay with me." Walter's eyes fluttered, found Duke's face, and something like a smile tried to form on his gray lips. His hand twitched against his chest, and he tried to say something, but it came out as nothing more than a broken wheeze. "Don't talk. Don't you talk. Just breathe." Duke's voice cracked down the middle, all that steady calm he'd carried through the whole ordeal shattering apart now that the danger had passed, and there was nothing left to do but watch. "Somebody call an ambulance! Now!" "Already on the way!" Big Mike's voice boomed from somewhere behind him, raw with panic. 2 minutes out, Duke! They're 2 minutes out!" 2 minutes felt like a lifetime. Duke gently lifted Walter's head into his lap, cradling it the way you'd hold something precious and breakable, something that could shatter if you weren't careful enough. Walter's eyes stayed on his face, glassy and unfocused, but still trying, still fighting to hold on. "You hear that?" Duke said, his voice shaking now, no longer bothering to hide it. "Help's coming. You just gotta hold on a little longer. You hear me? You held on for 30 years waiting to find out what happened to that kid under the bridge. You can hold on 2 more minutes." Walter's lips moved. Barely a whisper. Duke leaned down close, his ear almost touching the old man's mouth. Proud. The word came out broken, barely there at all. Don't you say goodbye to me, Duke said, his throat closing around the words. Don't you dare. You hear me, Walter? You stay right here. Somewhere behind him, a woman was sobbing, thanking God over and over, clutching her daughter in a purple butterfly shirt tight against her chest. The choir microphone still squealed faintly on the abandoned stage. None of it mattered. None of it reached Duke at all. Then the sirens grew louder, closer, until an ambulance came tearing through the school gates, tires screeching against the pavement. 2 paramedics jumped out before it had even fully stopped, a stretcher already rolling between them. Sir, we need you to move back, one of them said, gently pulling Duke's arms away from Walter's shoulders. Let us work. Duke stumbled back, his hands trembling, streaked with the old man's sweat, watching as the paramedics worked fast and sure, sliding a mask over Walter's face, calling out numbers Duke didn't understand. They lifted him onto the stretcher, and Walter's eyes had closed now, his body limp, his chest barely rising. Is he breathing? Somebody tell me if he's breathing. Nobody answered him. The stretcher rolled toward the open doors of the ambulance, and Duke followed without thinking, his boots moving on their own, his mind blank with terror. The doors slammed shut in front of him, and for one horrible second he thought they were leaving without him. Then Big Mike was there, shoving him toward the passenger side, shouting at him to get in, to follow behind, and Duke moved like a man in a dream, climbing onto the back of his bike with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, the ambulance's siren screaming down Main Street ahead of him, carrying away the only father he had ever known. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. Duke sat in a plastic chair too small for him, his elbows on his knees, his big hands hanging loose between them. They still had Walter's blood on them, dried brown in the creases of his knuckles. He hadn't washed them yet. He didn't know why. Maybe some part of him wasn't ready to let that go. Big Mike sat beside him, silent, his leather vest creaking every time he shifted. Every few minutes he'd glance over at Duke, open his mouth like he wanted to say something, then close it again. There wasn't anything to say. Not yet. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. Nurses walked by in soft shoes, their footsteps quiet on the tile. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped, steady and slow. Duke stared at the double doors Walter had disappeared through hours ago, willing them to open, willing someone to walk out and tell him it was going to be fine. Nobody came. He thought about the boy he used to be. 16 years old, curled up under a bridge with a torn blanket and an empty stomach, so scared of the world he'd stopped believing anyone in it could be kind. He thought about Officer Walt Higgins crouching down in front of him that night, not with handcuffs, but with a granola bar and a soft voice, asking his name like it mattered. Nobody had ever asked Duke's name like it mattered before that. And now, 30 years later, that same man was lying behind those doors with tubes running into his arms because he'd thrown his frail body between Duke and a bullet. This is my fault, Duke said, low, almost to himself. Big Mike turned. Don't. He's 70-some years old, Mike. He shouldn't have been anywhere near that fight. He should have been sitting in the front row watching the school assembly, not throwing himself at a man with a gun. He made a choice, Big Mike said. Same as you did on that highway. You don't get to take that away from him. Duke shook his head, staring down at his hands. I got him into this. If I hadn't stopped that bus, hadn't gone digging around trying to find Carol, none of this happens. Tillman never even knows my name. And Carol Jennings is still in that root cellar, Big Mike said quietly. Or worse. Duke didn't answer. He knew Mike was right, but knowing it didn't make the guilt sit any lighter in his chest. It just added more weight on top, until it felt like his ribs might crack under the pressure of it. He thought about the newspaper clippings Walter kept in that old shoebox, 30 years of them. Every article about Marsh and Son's garage, every little thing Duke had ever done that made the local paper. Walter had followed his whole life from a distance, quietly, never once reaching out, never once asking for anything back. He just wanted to know the boy turned out all right. And this was how Duke had repaid him, by becoming the reason he might not walk out of this hospital. The hours crawled. Duke got up twice to pace the hallway, twice sat back down when his legs gave out from under him. Around 4 a.m, Big Mike brought him a cup of coffee from the vending machine that neither of them drank. The sky outside the window stayed black for a long, long time, and then, slowly, it began to soften at the edges, gray creeping in at the horizon like something rising from sleep. That was when Detective Ruiz walked through the sliding doors, her jacket rumpled, dark circles under her eyes, but something steady and clear on her face. Duke. She sat down across from him. Tillman's in custody, fully. He confessed. Carol Jennings, the plan for the school today, all of it, it's done. He's not getting out. Duke nodded slowly, but the words didn't land the way they should have. They just floated past him, distant and hollow, like something happening to someone else. Before he could say anything, the double doors swung open. A doctor stepped out, still in scrubs, a mask pulled down around his neck, his expression drawn tight and careful in a way that made Duke's stomach drop straight through the floor. "Mr. Marsh," the doctor said, "can I speak with you about Walter?" Duke stood up so fast the plastic chair scraped hard against the floor. "Is he alive?" The doctor held up a hand, calm, practiced. "He's alive. It was a heart attack, a bad one, but we got to him in time. He's stable now. Resting. The next 24 hours will tell us more, but right now he's breathing on his own." The air rushed out of Duke's chest like a dam breaking. He sat back down hard, his hands over his face, and for a moment he didn't trust his own voice to work. "Can I see him?" "Not yet. Let him rest. I'll come find you the second there's a change." The doctor gave a small, tired smile before disappearing back through the double doors. Big Mike put a hand on Duke's shoulder, and that was all either of them said for a long while. By morning, word had spread through Millbrook like fire through dry grass. Duke didn't know how. Maybe a nurse had said something to her sister, who told her neighbor, who posted it online. Maybe it was just the way small towns worked, news traveling faster than trucks on the highway. Whatever the reason, by 7 o'clock, the hospital parking lot was filling up with cars that had no business being there. By 8, there were candles. Duke stood at the window of the waiting room, looking down at the small crowd gathering on the lawn below. Parents from the school, the lady who ran the diner on Main Street, even Mrs. Kowalski, who'd once pulled her daughter across the street rather than let her walk past Duke's garage. She was down there now, head bowed, a candle flickering in her cupped hands. Casserole dishes started arriving around 9, carried in by church ladies who didn't ask permission, just set them down on the little table by the vending machines with sticky notes that said things like, "God bless you, Duke, and thank you for our children." Someone brought a card, signed by half the third-grade class, crayon drawings of motorcycles and hearts stapled to notebook paper. Duke didn't know what to do with any of it. He'd spent 15 years building walls brick by brick, expecting the town to always see the leather vest before they saw the man wearing it. Now the walls were being knocked down by people who wanted nothing back, and it left him feeling exposed in a way that scared him more than any fight ever had. He couldn't sit still in the waiting room anymore. Too many eyes, too many hands reaching for his, too many voices saying he was a hero. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd gotten an old friend nearly killed. He wandered the hallways until he found a small door marked Chapel and slipped inside. It was quiet in there, dim light through a stained glass window, a handful of empty pews, a wooden cross on the wall. Duke sat down in the back row, elbows on his knees again, same position he'd held all night, and finally let himself break. The tears came without warning, silent at first, then shaking his big shoulders like something breaking loose after being held too long. He thought of Walter's hand gripping his arm on the bus. He thought of the shoebox full of clippings. 30 years of a stranger believing in him when Duke hadn't even believed in himself. He thought of all those candles outside, all that food nobody asked him to earn. "I don't deserve this," he whispered to the empty room. "Any of it." The chapel door creaked. Big Mike stepped in, quiet for a big man, and sat down beside him without a word. "They don't know who I really am," Duke said, wiping his face roughly with the back of his hand. "If they knew half of what I did before, the fights, the mess I made of things, they know you good enough," Big Mike said. "Walter's in there because of me." "Walter's in there because he loves you," Big Mike said, steady as a rock. "That's not a debt, Duke. That's not something you pay back by being perfect. Family don't work that way. You don't earn it. You just get chosen, and you choose back." Duke stared at the wooden cross, throat tight. "Nobody's ever chosen me for free," he said quietly. "Not once. Not till Walter." "Well," Big Mike said, "looks like this whole town's lining up to do it twice." 2 days later, the doctor found Duke in the waiting room, still in the same chair, still in the same clothes, a paper cup of cold coffee sitting untouched by his boot. "Duke," he looked up so fast his neck cracked. "He's stable. The surgery went well. He's weak, but he's awake, and he's asking for you." Duke stood, and his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "You can see him now. 5 minutes. He needs his rest." 5 minutes. Duke would have taken 5 seconds. He followed a nurse down a hallway that smelled like bleach and old flowers, past rooms with soft beeping machines, until she stopped at a door and nodded for him to go in. Walter looked smaller than Duke remembered. Smaller than the man who'd gripped his arm on the bus just days ago. Tubes ran from his hand to a bag on a metal pole. A monitor beeped steady and slow beside the bed. His skin looked thin as paper, but his eyes, when they found Duke standing in the doorway, were clear, and he smiled. Just a little. Just enough. "There he is," Walter whispered, his voice rough like gravel. "Big as ever." Duke's throat closed up. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took the old man's hand, careful, like it might break. "You scared me half to death," Duke said. "You know that?" "Takes one to know one," Walter said, and even weak as he was, there was a spark of humor in it, the same spark Duke remembered from 30 years ago, though he hadn't known it then. "You planning on giving me a heart attack every time we meet?" "Not funny?" "A little funny." Walter's fingers tightened weakly around Duke's hand. "Sit down, son. My neck hurts looking up at you." Duke pulled the plastic chair close to the bed and sat, still holding on like letting go might undo whatever miracle had kept this man breathing. For a while, neither of them said anything. The machine beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled past. Duke just sat there, looking at the lines on Walter's face, thinking about all the years those lines had been forming while Duke didn't even know his name. "You didn't have to do that," Duke finally said. "Step in front of me like that. You could have died, Walter." Walter turned his head slow on the pillow, eyes steady on Duke's face. "I've had a good, long life," he said. "Longer than I ever thought I'd get, back when I was young and dumb and thought I could save the whole world one traffic stop at a time." He paused to catch his breath, the effort of talking clearly costing him something. "But you were the one thing I got right." "Walter, let me finish." His voice was faint, but there was no arguing with it. 30 years I wondered what happened to that boy under the bridge. I prayed for you. Some nights, when I couldn't sleep, I'd take out that box of clippings and just look at your picture, wondering if you were even still alive out there somewhere. Duke felt his eyes burning, hot and sudden. "Finding out you made it," Walter went on, "that you didn't just survive, but you turned into a man who stands between danger and children on a lonely road, a man this whole town trusts with their kids now. Duke, that was the proudest moment of my whole life, prouder than my badge, prouder than anything I ever did on that force." "I didn't remember you," Duke said, voice breaking. "All these years, and I didn't even remember your face." "Doesn't matter." Walter squeezed his hand, weak but sure. "I remembered enough for the both of us, and watching you carry that woman out of the woods, watching you stand up at that school and talk to those kids. That was my redemption too, Duke. Not just yours. Mine." The tears came for both of them then, quiet and unashamed, an old man in a hospital bed and a big, rough biker with tattooed arms, both of them crying without a single ounce of shame in it. "You saved my life twice now," Duke whispered. "Once under that bridge and once on that road." "Then I guess," Walter said, smiling through the tears, "we're square." A month later, the town square in Millbrook looked different than Duke had ever seen it. Folding chairs stretched across the grass in neat rows, and a small wooden stage had been built near the old oak tree at the center of town. Red, white, and blue banners hung from the lampposts. Someone had strung up string lights, even though the ceremony would happen in broad daylight. It didn't matter. The whole town wanted it to feel like a celebration, and it did. Duke stood near the back, tugging at the collar of a clean shirt he'd ironed twice, feeling more nervous than he had facing down Ray Tillman on the highway. Big Mike stood beside him, along with 6 other members of their chapter, all of them scrubbed up and looking uncomfortable in anything that wasn't leather and denim. "You'd think we were about to get married," Big Mike muttered, adjusting his own collar. "Feels worse," Duke said. Walter sat in a chair near the front, a blanket over his knees despite the warm afternoon, color back in his cheeks, his eyes bright. He caught Duke's gaze and gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "You'll be fine," the kind only Walter could give him. The mayor spoke first, thanking the police department, the searchers, the volunteers. Then Detective Ruiz took the microphone and talked about how a case that could have ended in tragedy had ended in a rescue, thanks to information from civilians who refused to give up. She looked right at Duke when she said it, and for the first time since Duke had known her, she smiled at him without a trace of suspicion. Then Carol Jennings walked up to the stage. She looked healthy now, her hair longer, her cheeks full of color they hadn't had when Duke carried her out of that cabin. Her husband stood near the front row, holding their little girl, who waved a small flag that someone had handed out. "I don't have fancy words for this," Carol said, her voice shaking but strong. "I just know that I was in that cellar for 3 weeks thinking I'd never see my daughter again. And then one day, the door opened. And instead of the man who put me there, it was a stranger with tattoos and a leather vest, looking at me like I was the most important thing in the world." She paused, wiping her eyes. "Duke Marsh and his brothers gave me my life back. They gave my daughter her mother back. I will never, as long as I live, forget that." The crowd erupted into applause, and Duke felt his face go hot. He wanted to disappear, but Big Mike's hand clamped onto his shoulder, holding him steady, the way it always had. When the applause died down, the school principal, a round, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Albright, stepped up to the microphone. She smiled out at the crowd, then found Duke's eyes directly. "Before we close today," she said, "the school board and I have an announcement. Starting this fall, Millbrook Elementary and Middle School will be launching a new program, a road safety and mentorship program for students and for at-risk teens in our community." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. "We want this program to be about more than just safety rules," Mrs. Albright continued. "We want it to be about showing our kids what courage really looks like, what it means to stand up for someone even when it's hard. And we can think of no one better to lead it than the man who stood between danger and our children on that highway." She looked straight at Duke now. "Duke Marsh, would you do us the honor of being our program's lead mentor, alongside, if he's willing, Mr. Walter Higgins?" The whole square turned to look at Duke. Big Mike gave his shoulder a squeeze. Walter, from his chair, raised a thin hand and gave a thumbs up, his eyes shining. Duke's throat tightened. He thought of the boy under the bridge, hungry and alone, believing nobody would ever want him around. He thought of every year since, building walls, expecting to be feared instead of trusted. He walked up to the stage, took the microphone with a hand that trembled just slightly, and looked out at the town that had once crossed the street to avoid him. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. "Yeah, I'd be honored." Duke pulled his Harley into the school parking lot just as the bell rang for the end of the day. The sound of it always made him smile now. It used to be just noise. Now it meant something. It meant 30 minutes until the kids came pouring out the side doors towards the gym, where the mentorship program met every Thursday afternoon. He killed the engine and swung his leg over the bike, tucking his helmet under his arm. A group of 5th graders spotted him from across the lot and took off running. "Duke! Duke, wait up!" He turned and grinned as they skidded to a stop in front of him. Tommy Aldridge, gap-toothed and loud, was in front as usual. Behind him came Sarah Chen, quiet and serious, clutching a folder of homework to her chest. And behind her, little Ellie Marsh. No relation. Just a kid who liked the name enough to ask if she could call herself Duke's honorary niece. "Hey, Tommy. Hey, Sarah. Hey, Ellie Bug," Duke said, ruffling the girl's hair. "You all ready for today?" "We're doing bike safety course today, right?" Tommy asked, practically vibrating with excitement. "The one with the cones? That's the one? Best get inside and get your helmets on." The kids scrambled off toward the gym, and Duke followed at an easier pace, nodding at a few parents dropping off forms at the front office. Nobody flinched anymore when he walked past. Nobody pulled their kids a little closer or crossed to the other side of the hallway. It had taken time, but somewhere along the way, Duke Marsh had stopped being the scary man on the motorcycle and started being just Duke, the man who taught the safety class on Thursdays. Inside the gym, Walter was already there, sitting in a folding chair near the cone course, a clipboard resting on his lap. He looked thinner than he used to, and slower too, but his eyes were sharp as ever, and there was color in his cheeks that hadn't been there in the hospital all those months ago. "You're supposed to be resting," Duke said, walking over. "Doctor's orders, remember?" Walter waved a hand like he was swatting away a fly. "Doctor doesn't know what it's like to sit at home doing nothing all day. I'd rather wear out than rust out." Duke chuckled and pulled a chair up beside him. "Big Mike said the same thing. Bunch of stubborn old men, the both of you." "Speak for yourself," Walter said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I feel more alive doing this than I have in 20 years. Duke didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at Walter, really looked at him, the way he had learned to do since the day at the hospital when he thought he might lose him. He thought about the boy under the bridge who Walter had once found, scared and alone, and how that same boy was standing here now, helping run a program that hadn't even existed until months ago. "Couldn't do this without you," Duke said quietly. "You know that, right?" Walter reached over and patted his arm, the same way he had done decades ago on a cold night under a bridge. "Couldn't do it without you either, son." The kids started filing in, some already wearing their bike helmets crooked, others carrying orange cones from the storage closet. Duke stood and clapped his hands together. "All right, everybody line up. Who remembers what we practiced last week about looking both ways before you cross?" Hands shot up all around him, and for the next hour, Duke walked the course alongside the kids, correcting their hand signals, praising their stops, laughing when Tommy nearly ran into a cone showing off. Walter sat nearby, calling out encouragement, keeping track of who needed extra practice, offering quiet words to the shy ones who hung back. By the time the session ended, the sun was beginning its slow drop toward the tree line outside the gym windows. Parents arrived to collect their children, waving to Duke and Walter as they left, some stopping to shake Duke's hand, others just calling out a cheerful goodbye. Duke helped Walter gather his things and walked him slowly to his car, making sure he got settled behind the wheel safely before shutting the door. "See you next week," Walter said through the open window. "Wouldn't miss it," Duke replied. He watched Walter's car pull out of the lot before heading back to his own motorcycle, waiting patient and steady in the golden afternoon light. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.